Good evening and welcome to the World Today. My guest is Professor Aijaz Ahmad, a distinguished public intellectual who is taught in a number of places, including the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, in India, for some years. He's written important books, of which In Theory is probably his best known work, and is currently Professor Comparative Literature at Irvine in California. I'm very pleased to have this guest in particular because I've been studying and reading him for a long, long time. Aijaz, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Tell me a bit about yourself, because I think it's very much linked to your work and your writings, your origins, so to speak. So you were born in Uttar Pradesh in India.
Right.
And you recall being lifted on your uncle's shoulder as the Indian flag was hoisted on Independence Day.
Right.
In August 1947. Afterwards.
Well, my parents were not particularly keen on either the partition or the Muslim League, or they were sort of pink, they were sort of Nehruvian Congress kind of people. So they had no particular desire to migrate. So they stayed on in India into the mid-50s, trying to remain there.
Whereas the bulk of the migration
That's right.
from India to Pakistan happened in 1947.
Yes.
At the time the continent
Right.
was divided,
Right.
the subcontinent
Between
was divided.
1947 and 1949, those 2 years was the time when, and much of my own family, various branches of it, was part of that migration and so on. My parents tried to stay on, wanted to stay on, but by the early to mid-50s, they felt both sort of isolated, but also the pressure of communalization had become very clear. That is to say, the Hindu right becoming dominant in the politics of Uttar Pradesh and so on. If you read Nehru's letters to the prime ministers, he's full of grievances that no one listens to me, the whole of the Uttar Pradesh Congress has become communalized and so on. So under those kinds of pressures, my parents went to Pakistan and left me in India for 2 years to finish my matriculation, my high school. And then I went to Pakistan, migrated to Pakistan, studied there for 6 years. I was at Forman Christian College in Lahore and remained a Pakistani citizen for a long time. Sometime around 1969-70, when there was a student uprising and a youth uprisings, I would say you would recall very well. After that, I actually left Pakistan went to the United States at that time. And then after 72, it was possible again to keep going back to Pakistan and so on. So much of the 70s I spent in Pakistan, involved in politics there. When the Zia coup came
in 1977.
1977, again for 3-4 years, I tried to wait it out, and after that I couldn't go back to Pakistan because of political reasons. So sometimes in the 80s I decided that I want to go all the way back to where we had come from, and there's collapse of the left in Pakistan at that time, so not much interest for me politically to go on in Pakistan. So I went back to India, and I announced to people there that I wanted to come back to India, and they said, well, not on a Pakistani passport. We can get you a visa for 6 months, something like that, but not that. Get us a passport from UK or USA or something, and so on. So I surrendered my Pakistani passport to get an American passport in order to go back and live in the country of my origin, where I was born. And by Then a law was being passed in the Indian Parliament under the Congress, not again under the BJP or something like that, under the Indian National Congress, that anybody who may have been born in India, but if you have held citizenship, a Pakistani citizenship, you are no longer categorized as a person of Indian origin. And therefore, you can neither get a visa nor can you recover your citizenship. Whereas, this is an exception to a law in India which says that anybody who was born in India or whose parents were born in India can reclaim their citizenship. This is the law.
Except if you want.
Except those who have
went to
held
Pakistan.
a Pakistani citizenship at any time. There was a sort of an informal arrangement with the government that I'll get 5-year visas on some pretext or the other.
And you did.
And for about 20 years, I lived there on these 5-year visas, teaching here, teaching there, and that became the basis on which these visas would be issued to you. After the 2014 elections, it became very clear to me from informal sources.
This is where the victory of the
Yes, after
Hindutva brigades. Yeah.
That's right. That I may or may not be able to get that visa. And, by then, the University of California at Irvine had invited me as a visiting professor, and they were asking me if I would like to come there as on a full-time position. So I found it expedient to actually come back to the United States. But I am one of those last remaining people who claim both India and Pakistan as his countries. I've been a citizen of both. I don't choose between the two. Both are in dreadful conditions. I accept that fact.
Aijaz, let's come to the present moment.
Right.
Many people, including some on the left, underestimated the effect on world politics of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
You know, whatever you may think of that country, whatever critique you might have, the more time passes, the more we realize what a fundamental thing that was. The fact that this state had ceased to exist, which created a new space, new vacuums, new ideologies. One of these, of course, which is known by the word globalization, which is effectively, you know, capitalism rampaging all over the world without any restrictions whatsoever, and the attempts to restrict it through concepts like sovereignty, nationalism, no longer work. I mean, it's been a very thoroughgoing process and people are struggling. Attempts are made here and there. Attempts are crushed. 9/11, the conquest, recolonization processes in Iraq, the destruction of the Middle East, the war in Afghanistan, the right of the American president to invade any country he might desire, which is now legal, the right of the US president to order the execution of any US citizen, unheard of, I mean, even within the imperial framework in which that country exists. How do you explain all this?
All right. I think there were two fundamental processes in the 20th century. One was the attempt to build a socialist society, some sort of an alternative to capitalist society of some kind or the other. And the other was the anti-colonial movements of various sorts, essentially the dismantling of the great imperial colonial system.
European.
Yes. What has happened is that the Western left looks at the Soviet Union only in relation to the question of building of socialism, and particularly in relation to the possibility of revolution in the West. They underestimate, very often don't even take into consideration the seminal role that the Soviet Union played in the growth and formation and growth and victory of the anti-colonial movements.
And the Chinese and Vietnamese.
And I was about to say that one of the fundamental shifts that occurs now, retrospectively looking at it, with the October Revolution, is that the center of gravity for anti-capitalist revolutions shifts from the West to the East. These two fundamental facts are often overlooked by the European left. I was much less fond of the Soviet Union when it was there. I have become much more benign toward the Soviet Union after its collapse, because once they have won, even the dead are not safe. Whatever was good about that world must be forgotten. And it must be reconstructed as an evil empire. So that's one sort of thing. The other thing is, Tariq, that you mentioned in theory. In the opening chapter there, where I map out the situation of the world at the time when I was writing that book, I actually wrote there that there are three kinds of impasses that have occurred in the 70s. On the one hand, the long-term stagnation of the advanced capitalist countries begins in the early 70s.
Absolutely.
Secondly, what I call the nationalism of the national bourgeoisie in the third world reaches its limits, sometimes through defeat, very often through defeat, through coups d'etats, this, that, and the other, and so on, and sometimes by reaching the limits of its own possibility, not being able to proceed any further. And thirdly, the stagnation, delegitimation of the existing socialist systems after 1968, particularly after Czechoslovakia. Yeah. So by the mid-1970s, we are already in that kind of multiple crises in three different regions of the world. And that begins to then manifest itself in various locales, such as the Iranian Revolution and the ambiguities of that, the biggest working class strike in the history of the Middle East, leading to a clerical fascist sort of regime, and so on. The years of 77 to 80, I think, are decisive in more ways than one. You had the Islamic Revolution, you had the military takeover in Pakistan, and you had a quasi-communist coup in Afghanistan. And the region within which I was located changed. That was immediately after the emergency in India. So that was one side of it, but the historic thing in those 3 years is China, the Deng reforms of 1978 onwards. And I think that is where the crisis of communist state system actually begins in China in 1978 rather than in the Soviet Union in 1989. So there is that. Now, with the collapse of the communist experiment, both in China and the Soviet Union, the only alternative that any Asian African country had.
Nationalism.
Well, what's gone?
That's gone.
You know, that's gone.
Yeah.
When I would talk to the high officials of the Indian government, I remember talking to Narasimha Rao, who was the Prime Minister of India, and he said, look, Soviet Union died on me. I had no choice.
Even right-wing politicians felt that.
Absolutely. I had actually asked him a very different kind of question. I had asked him, that I hear that at the time of the emergency, you wrote a letter to Indira Gandhi that the Congress needs to carry out radical land reforms in Andhra of the kind that the communists had carried out in West Bengal. Is it true? And if that is true, then how did you travel from there to the kind of policies that you adopted in '89? And he smiled and he said, of course it's true. And then he said to me, the Soviet Union died on me. What could I do? I had no choice. So that business of we have no alternative became the mantra of all these third world countries and so on, which was partly true.
It had a material basis.
Absolute material base.
We can't deny that.
Absolute material base, and this is again something that a lot of the European left, I think, needs to take into consideration. And once all of that was gone, it was inevitable that whatever the people's movements, working class movements, left politics of various sorts, had been able to win during that, if you call it the Red October century, had to be taken back. So comprehensive attack on the working classes of the West that has occurred since then is very much a part of that dynamic. Of, Cold War did not go away. It was won by some people, and others were defeated. And the winners are taking their revenge. And we are still there in that period. And this destruction that is going on, there's that. The last thing I would say at the moment is that 2 Second World Wars were fought to decide whether Germany or the United States would inherit the British and the French empires.
Yeah.
Nazis had dreamed of a global empire. Americans obtained one.
Yeah.
So they have got what the Nazis had actually wanted. This has very, very serious ramifications. More recently, I've been working with these concepts that where we have arrived. You have written about the extreme center. You see, I think where we have arrived is a combination of things. One is, I think there is a transformation of the capitalist state going on. It is in transition to a sort of a post-democratic state. People jump too quickly to call it fascist.
No, that's
it is
ridiculous.
Not. It is not. But it is also not in some, in any stable sense, a democratic state. So that is the state form that is getting
ritual.
transformed.
In a way, it's partially also the ritual of the democratic system, which is becoming increasingly now institutionalized in traditional election once every 5 years. But the other aspect, accountability.
Yeah. Accountability, but also in India, for example, you have all the apparatuses of the liberal democratic system in place being ruled, however, by a political party which is not even in any traditional modern democratic or liberal sense a political party. It is a political front of the RSS, which is not a political party.
We'll return to that a bit later in detail.
So, same thing is happening in Turkey.
Yeah.
The reversal of the Kemalist state by these Islamicists with all the legitimation of the electoral system. Something radically different, but in the same vein, there is a crisis in Europe where national parliaments have less and less ability to legislate for its own people. And at a European level, you don't have a parliament, you have a bureaucracy. The parliament has very little to do. There's nominally a European parliament, but it is not something like the national parliament. So, so bureaucracy and finance capital is the formation through which European economy is being structured. over and above
Just
all that, yes.
The linked to this, of course, is the fact that the United States system
Sure, absolutely.
is now, it always was in a certain sense what they followed. I mean, if you want to put it in a sharper way, one could say that the Americanization of Europe, a process which started out of the Second World War, is now virtually complete.
Absolutely.
Culturally, politically, ideologically. So that the independence of this continent is gone. There's no country. I mean, I laugh sometimes here when the Conservatives attack Jeremy Corbyn for saying, would you press the nuclear button? And the reason I laugh is, and one has to tell him that the answer he gives is fine, it's very decent, but it lacks something. And what it lacks is that no British politician, no British Prime Minister of whatever hue can press any button without the Pentagon say
Absolutely,
so.
absolutely.
And in your later work, or some of the things you're working on at the moment, you talk about the German theorist, right-wing, conservative theorist, Carl Schmidt.
Right.
Who, of course, wrote a great deal about states of exception, about constitutional and judicial reforms, etc., etc., and who also wrote that all German conservatisms, including the fascists, are trying to do is win for themselves the same rights that the Americans got through the Monroe Doctrine. You controlled a continent which you called your backyard. Why don't you let us control the rest of Europe? This deal, quite interestingly, he made that connection himself. But when you look at the world now, I mean, the United States, despite our declines and despite Trump, still remains the most powerful imperial power, if not the only one in the world. So the debates of that old period are haunting us once again.
Yes, and the text that you're referring to, in that very text, what I have argued is that Schmidt wrote this, I think, is absolutely brilliant mind. The fact that his politics was absolutely the opposite of mine is a different matter.
Yeah.
But it's a brilliant mind. That he wrote about the question of sovereignty in the days when nation states actually used to exist. Even the colonial powers were actually nation states which had colonial empires and so on and so forth. What you have now, precisely because of the manner in which the US has dominated Western Europe as well as Japan, and because it emerged as the victor in the Cold War, you now have this preeminent imperial power. I don't believe there are any other imperialist powers in that sense. And since 9/11, the United States has now asserted something that I call the imperial sovereignty, in which no other sovereignty matters, none whatsoever. They can dictate to anybody. If they want their intelligence services to go out and take people off the European streets to send them into some torture chamber somewhere or the other, they have the right to do so.
And have done so.
And have done so all over Europe, including among the most powerful countries of Europe, Germany and so on. And so on. So there is now the assertion of an imperial sovereignty. Secondly, 9/11 has been used to declare an endless state of exception in which the US alone decides which of the international laws it will abide by and which of them it will not abide by and when. It's a presidential prerogative. It's not even the Congress of the United States. So you have a state of exception, you have an imperial sovereignty, and you have the making of sort of a post-democratic state in which the rituals continue and all of that. But extreme right-wing policies can be implemented through those same liberal. So this is, I think, unsustainable in the long run. But the result is that I think the European left has to rethink. I think the Western left is too enamored of this cosmopolitanism of, yes, globalization in its present form is bad, but we can, EU in its present form is bad, but EU. I think you have to seriously consider the possibility that the EU in its present form has to be dismantled and rebuilt from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm a Europeanist, yes.
Yes.
At the end of the day, it will have to be rebuilt. But within these processes, and I think something very alarming is going on in Europe, which is that with the collusion of the right wing of socialist parties, as it were, in Britain, Labour. Labour right and Tories together prevented Corbyn from getting elected.
Absolutely. Yes.
Same thing happened in France. You create such a thing about, fascist Le Pen and so on and so forth, that all the other parties can get together, declare that Mélenchon is some, ultra left alien, something, and they can all get together and they are relieved of the duty to adopt some programmatic positions that would address what the French working class is really about. So you have now a situation, I fear, Tariq, you live in this continent, I don't. My fear is that you have arrived at a point where the connection between the working class and any organized left is gone, or very minimal, at least on the continent. I think that is what is drawing so much of the working class in France, for example, to Le Pen's
Without any doubt. I mean, in fact, it's very interesting because Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was pretty orthodox on questions like being extremely hostile to trade unions, very pro-EU, supported Maastricht. She was clever because she sensed that there was a gap. And so her social program, one has to admit this, her social program was not that different from that of Sanders or Corbyn.
Right, absolutely.
And Mélenchon then fought back and won some of these layers over. So he got 19.8%, which is the highest vote the left has got in France. So it's very polarized, but the parties which have completely let their constituencies down are the extreme center parties, center left and center right. Now, the French case, being France, even the way they reassert the center is brutal. They've destroyed two parties in the process.
Right. They have.
Whereas it's interesting, whereas here, politics is once again coalesced around the two main parties, and the smaller parties have been wiped out. In France, the socialists are virtually wiped out. I'm told they're thinking of selling their headquarters in Paris. They can't afford to carry on and pay their staff.
Really?
Yes, it's a very serious situation. And Macron has effectively incorporated some of the
others
from the conservative side of things. So it's a weird situation, but I think it's volatile. I don't think that this is a stable situation. It's a big attempt to contain discontent.
Quite right. Very good.